If you're over 50 or if you're getting close and you're suddenly gaining belly fat, even though nothing about your diet or exercise has changed, you're not imagining it. Something actually changed, and it's not your willpower, it's your biology. Men and women both experience this, but for different reasons. Hello, health champions. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly why belly fat changes after 50 and what to do about it. When we talk about belly fat, we need to understand that there's two types. The first one is called subcutaneous. That means under the skin. And this type is primarily an energy reserve. It's kind of inert. It doesn't do much. And this is the one that you can kind of grab. You can pinch it, or you can grab a little roll if you have a little more of it. But it doesn't participate much. It's just sitting there as a reserve. The second type, though, is called visceral, meaning organ, because it's in between the organs. The subcutaneous is outside of the muscles, your abdominal muscles. The visceral is inside the muscles mixed in with the organs. And the reason we differentiate between these is that they're very different. And the visceral is not just passive storage, even though it does make up storage as well. The difference is that the visceral is basically an endocrine organ. It has hormonal properties. It releases substances, and it releases cytokines. Those are inflammatory signals. That's what cytokines are. And they basically tell the liver to stay inflamed and to stay insulin resistant and to keep storing more fat. So there it becomes a vicious cycle because it tells the liver to store more fat, which of course then is visceral fat, which tells the liver to store even more, and so on. So even though there are some commonalities, we need to understand how this differs between men and women. So the dominant hormone for men is testosterone, and here's what testosterone does. It builds and preserves lean muscle mass. When we're younger and we have plenty, that's what it does. It also has a tendency to drive the fat to peripheral storage, meaning outside of visceral fat. It helps upregulate insulin sensitivity in muscles, and it competes with cortisol in its catabolism. So cortisol is a catabolic hormone. It breaks things down. So you've probably heard that cortisol is a stress hormone. And when we're stressed, we're just trying to stay alive for now. We're putting out fires. We don't really care about health or making everything perfect. We just need to survive. So now if we're burning bridges, if we're breaking things down, so be it. We just need to make it through the next few moments. Testosterone, however, is an anabolic hormone. It competes, it counteracts that breakdown. Now, here's the thing about testosterone. In general, testosterone decreases by 1% per year after age 30. And this is cumulative, so by age 50, this effect really hits hard. And with decreasing testosterone, now what happens is we start losing muscle mass, we start declining in metabolic rate, we start increasing our visceral fat accumulation, the bad one that acts inflammatory, and we're also going to change our ratio between estrogen and testosterone. If testosterone goes down and estrogen stays the same, the ratio is going to change. And there's a special mechanism in men that is very, very important to understand. And both insulin resistance, an increase in insulin resistance, and an increase in visceral fat will both promote an increase in an enzyme called aromatase. And what this aromatase does is it converts testosterone into estrogen. So now we further change that ratio. We further increase the ratio of estrogen to testosterone. And what a lot of people don't realize is that if you have a lot of visceral fat and you have a lot of insulin resistance and you take testosterone as a supplement or as a cream, all that happens sometimes is that you turn all that testosterone into estrogen. And we also said that testosterone helps offset the breakdown effect of cortisol. So now with less estrogen, the cortisol effect, the breakdown, is less buffered. So this sounds kind of depressing, but all is not lost, because we need to understand that out of all these effects that we're talking about, we can ascribe maybe 1/3 to aging. But then that means the other 2/3 is about lifestyle, which means we can do something about it. So most of these effects we can do something about. We can offset most of it with a proper lifestyle. And women have some similar mechanisms, but here is what's different. The dominant hormone for women is estrogen, and here's what it does normally when we're younger. It directs fat to the hips and the thighs. And of course, when it's on the hips and thighs, it's not inside, it's not visceral, so therefore it counts as subcutaneous fat. Also, this is considered protective because it's not visceral, it's a better type of fat. It doesn't signal inflammation. And this is called a gynoid pattern or a pear-shaped pattern. And healthy levels of estrogen when we're younger also protects insulin sensitivity, and it suppresses that visceral fat accumulation because it directs it to other places. Estrogen also supports leptin signaling. So leptin is the satiety hormone. When we've had enough to eat, then we want to tell the body that it's time to stop eating. And that signal works better when we have proper estrogen. But then what happens with women after 50 is menopause. So the average age for menopause is right around 50, 51. And now we get a very quick change in estrogen. So it drops due to menopause, and it can seem like it happens almost overnight. So now what happens rather quickly without as much estrogen, now there's less drive. The estrogen is what drove that fat to the hips and the thighs, and now instead the drive is going to be to the belly, to the visceral fat, because we're not driving it to the hips anymore. So by default, it sort of accumulates in the core, in the midsection. So now we move from this gynoid or pear shape into what's called an android shape or an apple shape. And just like with men, now we're getting an increase in visceral fat, which is going to signal more inflammatory cytokines. We're going to see an increase in insulin resistance, and this becomes a vicious cycle that reinforces itself. And just like with men, there is now less opposition to cortisol. There's less buffering to offset the cortisol effect. And what cortisol does, the primary purpose is to increase blood sugar. And when we release cortisol, we very often get cravings because that's one way to quickly raise blood sugar. But another way is to break down protein and turn it into glucose. So therefore, cortisol has a tendency to break down muscle. And if we don't use it up, if we're not actually having a stress that we need to physically react to, now that extra glucose from the cortisol gets stored as fat. And cortisol has a tendency to preferentially store it as visceral fat. So what happens now, if people there's diseases where we have extremely high cortisol and then you get extreme expressions of this, but basically what cortisol creates is skinny legs, a flat butt, and a big belly. And the cruel irony at this point, of course, is that you haven't actually changed anything. You've been eating and working and doing the same stuff, but your fat storage instructions have changed. Your hormones have changed to where they tell the fat to go to different places and increase the tendency to store visceral fat. And for many people, it seems like this happens almost overnight. So while there are some differences in men and women, the common factor is that each have hormonal changes, and with aging, we have some degenerative changes that just go on with time as the years pass. But what it leads to is that insulin resistance worsens after 50, both for males and females. And insulin is a hormone that both stores fat and locks it in. So first, it helps store it. It helps convert carbohydrates into fat. But then once it is in fat storage, high levels of insulin also prevents us from retrieving it. It locks it down there. And then what makes it even worse is that insulin resistance causes visceral fat, but then visceral fat in turn is both a cause and a result. It's a consequence of insulin resistance. So again, we have one of these vicious cycles. Still, we have to realize that fat does not appear out of nowhere. We still have to eat a certain way. We still have to eat in a way to produce these hormones. So what really happens when we age and we go through these hormonal changes is that it lowers your tolerance for an unnatural lifestyle. So when you're younger, we're not supposed to eat sugar. We're not supposed to be sedentary. We're not supposed to eat all these processed foods. But a lot of the stuff that you can get away with when you're younger, now you just don't have that tolerance. You just don't have that margin anymore. And this is why it's more important than ever to learn about these things, to understand the mechanisms so you know what's going on, and then to adopt a healthy lifestyle. And if you watch me, you probably heard me say that I'm all for exercise. I can't overemphasize exercise enough. However, exercise alone is not going to fix this, because a lot of people, they think that, well, you know, I got some belly fat, and there's hundreds and hundreds of videos who claim to be a quick solution, promise amazing results in virtually no time. But cardio training and crunches are not going to fix this, I promise. First of all, there's no exercise that can reduce spot fat. Okay, you can't direct training at a certain body part and expect the fat to go away from there, because fat goes from the storage into the bloodstream and it affects the entire body equally. It does not pull it from the area that you're working. Secondly, the thing that most people call aerobic training is not aerobic. The thing that people call cardio usually involves getting your heart rate up to 140 to 170 beats per minute and keeping it there for as long as you can, basically 30, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. But this is not aerobic training. It's huff and puffing training. And therefore, what happens is whenever you're huffing and puffing, whenever your muscles are burning, and there's nothing wrong with doing that sometimes a little bit, but when you do it because you think it's going to burn fat, it actually does the opposite, because it raises cortisol. When you huff and puff and you have burning muscles, you are releasing very high levels of cortisol, I promise. And cortisol, like we talked about, it increases blood sugar and it has a strong tendency to preferentially deposit fat in the visceral area. Also, something that you do want to do is resistance training to build muscle. Now, there's been a lot of myths, there's been a lot of misconceptions out there that people think, oh, if I just have muscles, muscles burn hot, they burn up all my energy, they burn calories. And yes, they burn a little bit more than fat tissue, but not enough to raise your basal metabolic rate significantly. If you have a ton of muscles, you might burn an extra 30, 40, 50 calories, but it's a few percent. That's not where the benefit comes from. The real benefit with muscles is that muscles equal longevity. Muscles equal quality of life. And the fact that muscles use up a lot of glucose during exercise. So we're going to cover 5 things of what really works. And the first thing is to lower insulin. And all of the things we talk about here are going to help lower insulin, but the main thing, the heavy load, the heavy burden, is going to be to change your diet. You want to cut out sugar and processed foods and refined carbohydrates, because most processed foods are going to be seed oils and processed refined carbohydrates. And bread and rice and starches that are refined carbohydrates, they turn into sugar, they turn into glucose. But the thing that's the worst is what we call table sugar, which is exactly the same thing as the sugar in fruit that contains fructose, because that clogs up the liver tremendously. Next thing you want to do to reduce insulin is to eat fewer meals in a shorter period of time. Basically, snacking is a myth. You do not need to snack. You want to eat 2 to 3 meals in a 6 to 8 hour period. And there is something called OMAD, 1 meal a day, that I've made a lot of videos and I've talked about it. And it's a great tool to break plateaus, to gain some momentum when you first get started. But as you age, it may not be the best thing to do year in and year out. I'm all for it now and then, periodically. But the problem is that as you age, it's harder and harder to eat large meals and actually break them down and absorb them properly. And this is especially true for protein. So as we age, we probably need a little extra protein because we have a harder time breaking it down and utilizing it, and we probably need a little extra. So I'm not opposed to OMAD, but you want to play around with this and see what works best for you, because some people, as they try to do OMAD and eat really large meals, they don't feel really good. Their stomachs, their digestive tracts just don't handle it really well. And sometimes they can get upset stomach and diarrhea and things like that. So just understand this and play with it. And if you need to eat smaller meals, then it's still fine to eat 2 to 3 meals, but try to keep them in a shorter time span. The second thing that really works is resistance training. And we want to do it for the right reasons. So we build glycogen storage capacity. The liver can hold some glycogen, but the muscles hold most of it. So if you can increase your muscle mass, now there is a better place. There's a larger place to store some of that carbohydrate so you don't have to turn it into fat. Also, the great thing about muscles is that they absorb glucose. It's like a sponge for glucose. When we're at rest, the muscles cannot take up glucose without insulin. We need insulin to activate a transporter to get that glucose in. But when we're moving, anytime a muscle is contracting, now it does not need insulin. It can activate that transporter and bring in that glucose anyway. And the sooner we can get on with resistance training and build and maintain muscle, the sooner we can preserve the tissue that is really hard to replace as we age. And there's been a lot of research done where they've shown a very, very strong correlation between muscles in general, leg strength and core strength in particular, but muscles equal longevity and quality of life. Because if we have muscles, we can do things, we can move, we can climb stairs, we can lift grandkids, and we're going to have a better quality overall. The third thing that really works is good sleep. And sometimes we joke about it. Sometimes it's almost like a virtue. Oh, I'm so busy, I never get to sleep. Or I pulled an all-nighter, especially when we're younger. And we can get away with it, again, to some extent when we're younger, but it's harder and harder to compromise that as we age. For one thing, most testosterone, most hormones are actually made during sleep. And what's very well established now is if you have even just one night of poor sleep, then the next day you're going to have as much as 25-30% higher levels of cortisol, which drives insulin and insulin resistance. So sleep, it's not just something that's nice to have. It's not just nice to not be tired the next day. Poor sleep has direct hormonal consequences. And again, when we're younger, we can get away with a lot of stuff, and it's not like less sleep is going to kill us directly. But the more we get poor sleep, it's going to reduce our tolerance. It's going to reduce our stress tolerance. It's going to reduce our ability to adapt to stressors in the world. And then that in turn is going to have consequences for our overall health. And as we talk about in this video, belly fat. The fourth thing that works is to lower stress. And again, we have stress. Stress is real. There's a lot of chronic stress in our lives. And when people talk about it, they usually talk about stress as being out there. But stress is your response to the events in your life. And you can't change what's out there, but you can change your response to them. And when we take steps to lower stress, we will lower cortisol. And like we said already, cortisol drives visceral fat storage. It's very preferential for storage in the visceral area. And cortisol also drives muscle breakdown, like we said. And stress is very real and it's very devastating. There's virtually no disease or condition or form of suffering that is not a component of stress. It may not be the only thing involved, but there's a component of stress in there. So therefore, it's not a luxury to practice breathing exercises and meditation. We're going to start thinking about it as a necessity in this day and age. And we want to practice mindfulness. Again, it's not the world out there that is the stress. It's your response to it. So if you pay attention to how you feel, and if you pay attention to how you react to things, and if you notice a little bit of reaction, then take a few slow breaths and center yourself and ask yourself, was this reaction really necessary? And here's a way that you can think about how important stress is and how important it is to reduce it. So you have 40 trillion cells in your body. They're all metabolic marvels. They're little machines that can do amazing things. It can build things and break things down and detoxify and so forth. And these cells, they are always listening to your conversation, okay? Because your thoughts, everything you're telling yourself, everything you're reacting to has a biochemical consequence. You're producing all these chemical messengers into your bloodstream that go out to the cells, and that's how your cells listen to your conversation. And cells cannot do their job in a war zone. In a war zone, they just try to cover up and they try to hunker down and wait for that blitz, that war to get over with so they can start healing, right? Your cells can only heal, they can only do their job in harmony. So a really good question to yourself would be to ask, to pay attention to your emotional state, to pay attention to your state of relaxation and peace, and ask yourself, am I producing a state right now that is conducive to my cells healing? Am I giving them the harmony that they need? And the fifth part is when we can reduce that visceral fat, now we're breaking the aromatase loop, those hormone elevations, those hormone imbalances that keep us stuck. And when we can break that, now we allow hormonal recovery in both men and women. And we want to focus more than before on protein intake and resistance training, because those will protect your muscles in women, especially when the estrogen goes down, and in men when the testosterone goes down. And we want to take sleep seriously. We want to start thinking of it as something important. It's not just something we do when we get to it. I'll see if I get around to it. No, I'm too busy. Sleep is the primary window for hormone production, but not just that. It also helps with detox in the brain, because the brain cells retreat, they shrink to allow for the flow of cerebrospinal fluid to clean it out. That's the primary cleanup mechanism in the brain. So lifestyle now becomes more important than ever after the age of 50, or if you're getting close to 50. And like we've said throughout here, it's really all that's happening is that we have less tolerance for deviation. And what's the deviation? It's the modern lifestyle. So we just can't tolerate it as much as when we were younger. Now, on the upside, on the positive side, is that most of the decline, most of the things that we blame on aging is actually something that we can offset by lifestyle. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.